Let's talk Tanya for the 24th of Shevat of a leap year. So, today we begin chapter 24, and up till this point, we've learned about this one principal, greatest truth that there is. The truth of Einoid Mulvadi, the truth that there is nothing but Hashem, Hashem's unity. And we've also learned that every time we do a mitzvah, every single time we study Torah, we are manifesting and expressing this truth, the truth of God's oneness in ourselves and in the world. What is the opposite of God's unity? The opposite of God's unity is idolatry. In the Ten Commandments, the first commandment is about God's unity, belief in God's unity, and the second commandment is about the prohibition against idolatry. Now, what is idolatry? So a childish understanding of idolatry is there's a little trinket made out of wood or made out of gold or silver, and a person bows down to it. But in a deeper sense, what is idolatry? Idolatry is the opposite of God's unity. The belief that there's anything other than God, anything of significance, importance, anything that has authority whatsoever, that is the essence, the definition of what idolatry is all about. Now, if a mitzvah is the ultimate expression of God's unity, think for a moment. Obviously, an avera, a sin, is the ultimate idolatry. Because when we're talking about idolatry, and by the way, idolatry is synonymous with klipa, the forces of impurity. Klipa and the forces of impurity, they assert themselves and they consider themselves to be something of significance in addition to God. And is there anything more dismissive of God's unity and God's ultimate authority than a person saying, hey God, you told me that I should do X and I am doing Y. You told me not to do something and I'm going to go ahead and do it. In fact, the person who does a sin is even worse than the spiritual forces of impurity, the spiritual idolatrous forces, because ultimately all the spiritual forces don't have free choice. And although they might be repulsive and they might consider themselves to be important, they wouldn't actually defy God. A person who sins is even worse than klipa, because that person is actually so separating him or herself from God's unity to the extent of saying, God, I can do whatever I want. I don't even have to take under consideration that which you are telling me to do. So what we have over here is a mitzvah is the ultimate expression of God's unity. A sin is the ultimate expression of idolatry. And therefore, as it turns out, all of Judaism really boils down to this one idea. Yes, there are a lot of mitzvahs. We have 248 positive commandments, and there are a lot of sins. We have 365 negative commandments. But what really is it all about? At every single moment in our life, we have a choice to make. We can affirm God's unity, or God forbid, we can reject God's unity. We can be an expression of Achdus Hashem, God's unity, or we can be, God forbid, an expression of idolatry over here in this world, which is why God only had to tell us those two commandments. The first two commandments are the only ones that we heard directly from God, because all the mitzvahs are encapsulated in the mitzvah of believing in God's unity, and all sins are encapsulated in the sin of idolatry. And this explains why our sages tell us, Ein Adam Oiver Avera Ella Imke Nichnas Beiruach Shtus, which means our sages make a very interesting assertion. They say that any time that a person sins, it's because they're overcome by insanity. The act of a sin is an act of insanity. The obvious question is, why is it insane to sin? You want to tell me that it's wrong and that it's rebellious and that it's a person not living in conformance with their divine mission, but why is it insanity? But now we can understand. We've established in the earlier chapters that every single Jewish person is absolutely ready to give up their lives so as not to bow down to an idol. Because when a person feels their essential connection with God is threatened, a Jew is willing to give up their life rather than to have that connection severed. But now we understand that actually every single sin is an expression of idolatry. It's the exact same thing. Every single sin is the utter rejection of God's unity, and therefore, ultimately, the severing of the relationship between the Jew and God. So why is it that a Jew is willing to give up their life in order not to bow down to a cross, for example, but then they'll go tomorrow and they'll eat a cheeseburger or whatever other sin they might do? That's insanity. It's the exact same thing. The only thing is, what causes this insanity is that we create these arbitrary red lines and we think, okay, bowing down to a cross or bowing down to an idol, that's something, that irrevocably and irretrievably harms my relationship with God. And that's a line I can never cross. But this little sin, is not a big deal. I'm still Jewish, I'm still connected, but that's insanity. That's not true. There is no difference. Now, yes, there are bigger sins and smaller sins, but the Alter Rebbe is very emphatic, and the Alter Rebbe explains the difference between a bigger sin and a smaller sin is only in terms of the after effects, how quickly one can recover and restore the relationship with God. But in terms of the actual moment of the sin, when a person is doing a sin, at that moment, every sin is the exact same thing, and every single sin is tantamount to idolatry. Now, with this, we've concluded a lot. We understand what the idea of God's unity is. We understand what idolatry is. We understand also why a mitzvah is an expression of God's unity, why every single sin is ultimately not any different than idolatry. How do we take all this information and tie it together and use this information to leverage our Ava Misuteres, our hidden love, in order to be able to serve God at all times and be able to win our struggle against the animal soul? That we will find out starting in tomorrow's Tanya.